the Business of Family webinar. Today's episode involves a fireside chat regarding how C-suite and family business founders and owners and other high-profile individuals in enterprising families navigate some of the worst crises within the family infrastructure and within closely held business structures. The three of us, a lawyer, an executive coach, and a PR professional, are going to discuss protection of families, of the family infrastructure, and of the business, both before any crisis hits in the hope that it might not happen, or during crisis, which is what happens more frequently than not, and mitigating its aftermath, which we all call damage control. I'm Lisa Cukier. I'm here with Burns and Levinson. We are a full-service firm. We handle divorce, fiduciary service, trust and estate planning and litigation, business law, corporate transactional and litigation, real estate, intellectual property. My practice involves representing individuals and families, and individuals especially who are high profile in issues relating to sophisticated divorce, prenuptial planning, fiduciary representation, meaning guardianship, conservatorship, trusteeship, as well as trust and estate litigation and other family law issues where there is risk to a family business, to family trusts, and to family wealth. In our presentation, which is a discussion from boardroom to dining room, we're going to talk about some of the unique situations when it comes to owning and operating a family business. Whether you're in the first generation or next generation or several generations in, family businesses have their own set of challenges and opportunities. And we're going to host a fireside chat, and we welcome your questions. So while we are discussing together in fireside chat mode, if you have questions, put them into the Q&A. We're delighted to answer them. And I'm so happy today to introduce the two presenters who have joined me for today's episode. I'm delighted to call them colleagues and friends. With us are Nancy Capistran and Tara Goodwin. They are co-founders of Crises, Interception, a company that they founded. They have extensive experience helping family businesses navigate crisis situations, both from an executive coaching position and also from the public relations lens. They've received numerous awards, both individually and together. 5 years ago, they joined forces to form their own company called Crises Interception. The name was intentional. Think about what interception is and how it's different than intervention. It means to stop forward moving, to stop a moving train and instead shift direction and progress in a more favorable direction. And that's exactly what they do for people in family businesses, for high-profile individuals, and for companies as well. They differ from other crisis advisors in that they bring two diverse perspectives to the table. Nancy focuses on what's going on inside the company, the infrastructure. She helps the senior leaders, the executives, the C-suite individuals to make the most favorable decisions in extreme circumstances, while Tara addresses the court of public opinion and how stakeholders view the crisis from a public relations perspective to ensure effective communication across all channels. So we're delighted to have this dynamic duo join us today and provide insights. With that, I'm just going to announce some of the different categories of topics that we'll be discussing. Again, if you have any questions, throw them in the Q&A. We're happy to be extemporaneous and improv and answer your questions as well. But we'll be discussing the conflict between family bloodline and company lifeline. We will be discussing a mismatched handoff to the next generation and protection of the next generation from dissipation of family wealth. We'll be discussing what happens when we have a faltering founder owner, meaning somebody who's experiencing diminished capacity and potentially who's being influenced by somebody on the outside. We will discuss family embezzlement, which is an incredible topic. And I'm so delighted to have such experienced presenters to bring that to us and educate us about it. And finally, we'll be discussing the unexpected C-suite family member's death when there is no plan in place. all of which results in crisis. So with that, we'll turn right to the presentation. Let's talk about some of the experiences that we three have had with our clients and what are the common threads in our work and the way that we solve our clients' problems when those problems risk unraveling the success of a family business. Nancy, let me start with you. In your experience as an executive coach for business executives, what are the most common issues that you see when coaching family businesses? And tell us about your work coaching founders and owners and executives in enterprising families.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. Every family business is unique and complex in their own way. There's no one size fits all for what we're going to be talking about today and in day-to-day world. What I will tell you, this is kind of 4 key things that I see often, which do cause a lot of challenges with family business. I would say, the formal management structure that encompasses standard policies and procedures is one that I find is often, I'm looking at root cause of where these challenges, there's lots of issues that appear, but when you get to the root of it, these are kind of where they come from. So the formal business structure, management structure, and that the policies and procedures, that piece of it is a key. The other one is, when we think about family business, there's really 3 levels of complexity. There's family issues, business issues, and then ownership issues. And often when a dispute occurs, it can quickly cascade into the other areas. And so that's when I talk about, those complexities that are very unique for family businesses. And third, I would say is, when positions within the company are given, they should be based on merit. And sometimes with family members, that doesn't happen because they're a family member. They may get a better position that they may not be as skilled for. And that has a ripple effect throughout the organization, especially with non-family members. There could be some disgruntledness there and, then the credibility and things like that waver. So that's another issue. And the fourth one, which I think is one of the most important to focus on, is communications. Honest and open communication equally with family and non-family members is really mission critical. In my experience, that's where the core of most challenges happen.
Thank you. Tara, we heard in the news earlier this month that the family owners of Cane's Donuts are presently embroiled in litigation in the Massachusetts Superior Court over ownership, interest, and control. This isn't the first family business that this has happened to, and we've all been discussing it frequently over the past week or two. Tell us the highlights of that litigation and give us your perspective from a public relations perspective.
Sure, you're right, Lisa. This is not an uncommon situation in family businesses. In fact, right now, I'm working with a client with a very similar story. The reason that we're here today is because a lot of the thorny issues in family businesses come from 2 lacks. One is a lack of planning, and 2 is a lack of protection. And I think throughout today's webinar, you'll be hearing different stories that are all aligned with that same theme. So let's talk about Cane's Donuts and the highlights of the case that broke in the news earlier this month. Purchased by the Delios family, the parents, back in the mid-1980s, the business had a history. It was 65 years old when they purchased it. They gave each child, there are 5 of them, a 20% share. One child, Paul, is the president and CEO of the company, and he filed a lawsuit stating that his siblings were trying to freeze him out of the family business. He claims that he has grown the company from $500,000 in revenue to over $8 million. And he has nothing nice to say about his siblings. He says, quote, "They ascended to their positions through self-appointed roles and didn't have the experience or were as truly vested in the company as he was." And he also says that his siblings have made moves to try to reduce his salary and discredit him with a baseless investigation. He also tried to buy his other brother, Stephen, who left the family business in disgrace. He tried to buy those shares. And he offered $1 million for shares that were valued, I think, at 1.3 million. The siblings said no. They wanted to band together and try to buy the brother who left's shares. And the problem with that is that Paul said if they try to take that much money out of the business, it's going to hamper operations. So here we have a case that has hit the media, and no one from either side of the family has spoken. And why is that? It's because they want to try to settle it in a court of law, at least at this juncture. As a PR professional, one of the things that we do at Crisis Interception is work very closely with the lawyer, because there are certain things that could come out, and if they come out in a public way, they could be damaging to the reputation. And we don't want that to happen. So we look to the lawyer and look at what we can say and how we can respond. Now, I will say, if the DeLeos siblings started taking their gripes to social media, we might respond if we represented Paul accordingly, but it would be a measured response based on how he would answer those allegations. And we don't like to litigate in the court of public opinion, but often we have to, because you can't not respond in many situations. And so one of the things that is lacking here, at least from my view, is protections. A lot of this could have been avoided, I think, if there was a deeper family structure. So Lisa, how can enterprising families protect the family business from these kinds of issues facing the DeLeos family?
I think it's fair to say that, you know, when you smell smoke, you can anticipate there may be flame. These issues are combustible. They go from difficult and painful, where the family members feel the pain. They feel it sometimes for years. It may even be for decades, as this may be well ingrained in the family. And when you smell smoke, before you get to flame, you want to go to professionals who can help get you through this. These are challenging issues, and they cut to the heart of who we are. It cuts to our humanity to have these kinds of rivalries and difficulties in a family business. And as we were talking about, you know, boardroom to dining room, you can't get away from these issues, because if you've got a family business, you're living it at home and you're living it at work, or you're living it through your compensation, which of course we all know impacts our sense of value. So these are very difficult issues. My answer to the question would be to try to negotiate before you hit flame. Once you've gotten to the point of flame, then you're in litigation. And that often is a inelegant result. You know, it creates harsh results, and it creates a lot of public drama, and it impacts the business and the family terribly. So negotiation, as difficult as it may be for the parties, and to the extent that it forces them to confront head on the differences and to take them out from under the rug and deal with them, at least negotiation is an elegant solution, especially if the attorneys brought into it can operate with a level of sophistication and strategic, mature problem-solving skills. You know, if you've got good counsel and it's not a street fight, then it can be actually a rather elegant result. And even if you hit impasse, there's mediators out there. There's a lot of mediators, not only lawyer mediators and former judge mediators, but there are coaches and PR professionals and people who are trained in organizational psychology, business advisors who can help to mediate a situation like this. So a mediated or negotiated buyout is one solution. I had such a client. I represented somebody who was being squeezed out, and he came to me very upset. And ultimately, we just hastened it. We said, let's have at it. Let's just deal with the buyout before this becomes even worse. And we did that, and it was very successful. And right now the family is still bonded with some issues, but the buyout was one way to avoid litigation and to avoid letting difficult situations get worse. In another matter, I advised a client to take a look at the corporate documents and to start making some changes strategically when we were smelling smoke, so that we would have a better outcome in the event that something burst into flame. And we changed the provisions that relate to who is entitled to purchase and what could be purchased, what interest could be purchased, whether or not they were voting shares of the business, what kind of shares would be sold, who could purchase and at what point. And that at least created order and predictability in advance so that if there was a later problem, they would have the ability to navigate through it without litigation, because everybody would know how the dust would settle, and they knew that in advance. Another way that people do all the time, and they really ought to do it more often so there's less litigation, is just business succession planning. You plan for this and you create, you create fiduciaries for yourself so that you have some way to resolve this when you need to. Nancy, I'm sure that you've seen a lot of this in your work as well. How do you work with families when you sense those sibling rivalries among the next generation?
That's a great question, Lisa. And here's an interesting fact. It just reminded me of a client that I've been working with for a couple of years now. And it's more than just the sibling rivalry. When you get down to, further generations, so the second generation to the third generation, what's happening is it's not only siblings, it's cousins that are having some challenges, shall we say, and expectations, and who's going to take over the CEO role, and who's going to, be the CFO, and so there's a lot of infighting that goes on there, and they all come to the table with different, I guess, their truth, if you will, of what they see, and different views, different lenses. But it's also, what are their preferences and tendencies? What are their strengths? What are they motivated by? What are they stressed by? And trying to figure out the dynamics there as you go down in the generations becomes even more complex. And I will tell you with this one, the one that's the second generation to the third generation of family business, the third generation is, let's see, I believe that there's there's 6 kids, if you will, cousins. And I think some of them automatically know where some will fit, but others are really scrapping to almost sabotage their cousin or sibling to be able to try to get that bigger position. And there needs to be consistent management of that. If you don't, that's when the explosions happen, and that, it becomes really detrimental to the not only the family, but also the business. And trying to balance that is really takes some gentle finessing.
I'm sure not only inside, but on the outside in terms of what the public is seeing when that happens. Tara, when internal family discord creates the need to fire or remove from a leadership position a family member, what type of internal and external damage control do you recommend?
Well, you have to think about the audience. So Nancy would be talking to the family, would be talking about the issues surrounding what actually happens within the company. I'm focusing on what's going on with the employees, your key audiences here. I think when you're dealing with the firing of a senior leader in a company, whether or not he or she is a family member, you have to make sure that every single person in that organization understands, family member or not, you are going to be treated exactly the same way as other employees would be treated if there was a similar violation. Any violation of company policies has to be handled uniformly. There can't be any wink, wink, that's just Brother Joe. It has to be a strong statement from the CEO. We no longer, we do not tolerate this behavior. Our goal is to keep everyone safe and secure at this company. We have learned that this has happened, and it has to come out directly from the C-suite that this behavior will no longer be tolerated. And you can actually, manage through the storm if the CEO, forwards this information seriously and it's addressed swiftly, because people will say, well, we understand it happens in other businesses. And depending on the size of the company, it may or may not get out in the public. If it should get out into the public, what we recommend is a holding statement, a short, sweet statement that's written by me and then approved by the key executive. And we get that out to the media, and that is the statement on that particular issue. So there are no additional questions that could trip up a CEO when asked under pressure by a journalist.
I thank you. And I know that managing the storm, as you said, is very difficult. Nancy, how do you manage that storm in terms of sequencing and strategically managing this combustible scenario with Tara in your business crisis interception?
You know, it's an interesting dynamic. My brain thinks a lot like a project manager. I have a lot of experience in that space. And so when Tara and I first learned, we usually do a 90-minute debrief right at the beginning to get to the root. And we're both hearing it, but we're both listening for different things. And we can almost like instinctively know what the other person's thinking. And like, it's really interesting to see the two of us just kind of automatic pilot and go into that mode. But we really need to find out, again, the root cause of what's going on and what are the variables that are happening with that. And then we start prioritizing the sequence. You know, it's really important to have business continuity with the organization as well as managing the crisis. And trying to do that simultaneously is very, very difficult. And we're doing whatever we can to be able to help them, you know, with the day-to-day decisions and the strategic plan for the business, while also, you know, how do we diffuse this as quickly as possible and what needs to happen and in what sequence, how quickly. And once we do that, then we can really move forward in a combined effort to best support them and diffuse it.
Terrific. Let's move our conversation to the issue of mismatched handoff to the next generation and next generation protection from dissipation of wealth, because that's really at the bottom line here. This is really the heart of the issue, is protecting the family and the family business. So Nancy, how do you coach up the next generation of leaders to make their own mark on a family business without damaging relationships or the accomplishments of the previous generation?
That's a really tricky and complex question. There's so many dynamics that are going on and each situation is unique. What I would say is the current situation that I'm working with, you know, the CEO has his way of thinking and how he wants to do things, how he's always done things, how his father did things. So some of the things that his dad did used to drive him crazy. And I try to remind him, okay, remember when? And he would say, I understand. I said, okay, so this next generation has different views. They have different experiences. They're seeing it from a different lens. And you need to respect and appreciate that, as they need to respect and appreciate where you're coming from. And it needs to be open, healthy dialogue to be able to get those generations to kind of connect with each other, respect each other, and have clear guidelines around you know, rules of engagement, if you will, and the culture and the connection and how you keep each other informed and having open conversations versus conflicting and aggressive, you know, you don't understand me. And, you know, when it escalates like that, nobody's listening. So it's really about the active listening as well as understanding the audience in which you're speaking to and trying to connect with each other in a way that resonates most.
Tara, how do you portray succession and transition in a way that dispels myths of destabilization of the business?
And that's a great question, because often when there is a shift and a leadership change, people think, what's going to happen to the company? And does number two know enough? And are they well positioned to take on these roles and responsibilities? And I think from my lens, what I recommend is getting number two out in public as much as possible, running staff meetings, attending events, keynote speaking at key conferences. It establishes familiarity and credibility. Looking at ways that we can promote that next generation. We, at one point several years ago, I represent a family business. It's a manufacturing company out of Massachusetts, $300 million company, and it's gone through it's in its fourth generation, which, as you know, is quite rare. So they sort of have it down pat, but looking at ways that we could promote that that fourth generation to other people, like having an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about being a number two at a company, what's it like? So people become very familiar with the names and the places, and they start getting credit on their own, and those accolades start to build so that when the transition happens, and we recommend starting the strategy 6 months to a year out, because it does take time to get media, it does take time to register for conferences and secure those speaking slots. But when the transition comes, it's much easier, it's much more fluid, because people say, I've seen Sally out there on the stump. I know, and I feel very comfortable with her. And so I think that's really a solid communication strategy for introducing that number two into the company. And of course, number one has to be on board. That can sometimes be a problem. And then that goes to Nancy to kind of work with what are the core issues that are preventing you from, giving the reins to number two.
Yeah, I understand.
From your perspective though, Lisa, I mean, what problems have you encountered that deal with business succession when they want to kind of grab onto those reins really tight?
Yeah, resistance is the biggest challenge. And, I'm brought into these matters where there's resistance. Generally, you have a patriarch or matriarch of the business who has done a wonderful job for decades and who has grown a business extraordinarily and who very often is the governing member of the family. And nobody wants to step on that person's toes. That person is usually a spectacular business person and with all of the personality traits that go along with that, meaning that they're demanding and they're very certain about what they want, and they're the ones in control, the ones in charge. And so the resistance to succession planning can be very difficult. I had such a matter involving a gentleman who had a diminishment of his mental capacity and some health issues. And it was very difficult for the family. It was actually his wife and children who called me and said, we don't know what to do. It's really difficult. And the attorneys who'd been involved in their estate planning and their business succession planning also called me. They had multiple different entities and there were other attorneys calling me, and everybody looked to me and said, do something, what can you do? And so because of the diminishment of capacity, mental capacity that was just starting, it was not global, it was just starting, we were able to take some control using legal means just to relieve this gentleman of some of the pressures. He had been making decisions that were destructive for the business. Some of those decisions were destructive for the family finances, and he was taking family finances and putting them into the business and bringing down the value of the business. And so there were big problems and everybody was very concerned. We used conservatorship as a mechanism to take control of the business and take control of the family finances. The family members were involved. At one point, they needed to back out because it was such an emotionally difficult situation. Back to the theme of boardroom and dining room, it was difficult for the family to deal with this. And so we did need to bring in some neutrals. And that's what I did. I brought in neutrals. We had a neutral CEO. We brought in the people we needed to bring in. We had neutrals to help with the health issues and the diminishment of capacity. And we were able to sell the business before the business had any more significant trouble. That was one situation. In another matter, I was asked to preserve the reputation of a high-profile individual. And I needed to find the levers and the influencers. I was told by this individual's clinicians, don't let any more work projects take place. You need to intervene, you need to intercept, you need to do something here. And nobody knew exactly how to do it. They didn't want to upset the other stakeholders, other businesses and other corporations and very important people out there, academics. And so I needed to find the levers and I would reach out to people and ask a lot of questions and figure out intuitively, because I use a lot of intuition in my practice, it's not just law, but I figure out who are the levers, how can I get to the right people? And I did use people to give me introductions to those who I could speak with in order to start winding down projects and diverting different projects from happening, setting up structures that were easier. I'll tell you right now, given the pandemic, one of the structures that's easier is the use of Zoom. We don't have to have a potential patriarch or matriarch who is declining be in person anymore. We can now use Zoom, and that's a great opportunity. There's also written media. People don't have to be in person as much, and there's telephonic communications. So those are ways that I have helped where there's resistance.
Great. You know, Lisa, we all know that there's one vulnerability that's really kind of heart-wrenching, and it's a vulnerability for family businesses in divorce between family members. How can they best protect themselves and the business in this situation?
I think the first step, of course, is to have an attorney who understands not only divorce law, but business issues. When there's a business involved, it calls for a level of strategic elegance and a level of grace, because you've got more to protect than just an individual. You've got a family, you've got a business, and you have a lot of family wealth. And so it calls for the right personalities. And it calls for an approach that's not a street fight, that's not highly acrimonious, and that manages the different interests. In some of these cases, what I'll do is I'll bring in counsel for the corporation and I'll work with that person. Or if I'm representing the business, I'll bring in counsel for the individual. And we work together as a team against the other side, so that you've got a little more momentum, you have a team approach, and you have separate representation, because the interests are not always allied. And so you want to make sure that both the business and the individual going through the divorce are represented capably, and that their interests are allied where possible, but well represented where they're not necessarily allied. Some of the techniques that I've used in the past to help a family member through divorce where there's a business at stake is to think about front-ending alimony payments and back-ending property division. So for example, we might say, okay, we don't want an outgoing spouse to have an interest in the family business. The family business may be a marital asset, depending on whether there's a prenuptial agreement, depending on many different factors, the length of marriage. There's many factors that go into the question whether the family business is actually a marital asset for one of the partners in the business, one of the owners. And very often the answer is yes, it's a marital asset. And so one way to protect both is to front-end alimony and back-end property division. And what I've done in that situation is we pay a little more alimony up front. We don't divide the business. And then when, if, as, and when the business sells, then the outgoing spouse gets a percentage of the percentage that the owner receives. Or sometimes we'll leverage the business and we'll have a lender pay out some assets so that the business stays intact. The one thing you don't want to have is an outgoing spouse with fiduciary control over the business. So that's really key in these situations. Sometimes we can change the business documents and take steps like that to try to help. But those are techniques that I'll use in divorce.
Lisa, how do you advise families about family wealth protection, of family wealth and protecting the business and its fiduciary control?
So it requires a lot of planning. This is a real planning issue. Protection is usually about planning in advance. So sometimes I will be asked to do some prenuptial planning. Prenuptial planning is a way to segregate a set of assets so that they're not available in divorce. So for example, you could segregate business assets as being unavailable in divorce, and in that way protect the business. Sometimes there's trust assets or inheritance. Sometimes there's gifts that are made. And one of the best protections is through prenuptial planning. Sometimes I am asked to take a look at corporate documents in advance. We can make changes to corporate documents so that we are protecting a business from an outgoing member having fiduciary control. We could take a look at trusts and take a look at how we might protect those trusts. There are mechanisms to protect in the way of decanting. So we could actually take assets from one trust and decant them, meaning to pour them into a brand new trust. There was a case in Massachusetts where this was done by trustees. They actually went to court after they decanted. They poured all the assets from one trust, actually it was 75% of the assets, from one trust into a new trust that protected the new trust from invasion by an outgoing spouse. And the trustees then went to court and they asked the court to ratify the decanting that they did, and the court ratified it. It was a incredible case. There's actually a law in Massachusetts that says that once you file for divorce, there's a restraint on your ability to move assets or change them, change their quality. So one of the questions that I anticipate we'll hear in the future is whether decanting in some instances could be deemed a violation of that restraining order, whether decanting assets at the 11th hour before divorce or in the middle of divorce in order to shield those assets from an outgoing spouse, whether that might be deemed a violation of the automatic restraint on use of assets during the divorce. So these are all things that come up: strategic decanting, creation of strategic trusts to protect a business, change of business documents, business succession planning. These are all the ways that we protect assets in anticipation of divorce or in anticipation of any other kind of impact that might bring down the value of a business. I'm sure, Tara, that you deal with this from a PR perspective. How do you manage the PR and public perception in divorces of wealthy couples where business interests, real estate interests, and fiduciary control is at issue?
It's a good question, Lisa. And you mentioned something in your earlier comment about strategic elegance. And I always try to keep that front and foremost in my mind when I'm advising clients about what to do with their divorce. It depends on the level of notoriety of the couple who is getting divorced. If it happens to be a celebrity, often we issue joint statements so that it shuts it down immediately, because it always ends with, we ask for your privacy during this personal and difficult time, right? You remember Gwyneth Paltrow with her conscious uncoupling that made the news. And it was more about the statement than actually all the details in the divorce until it was finalized. So I think that if in fact a public statement is warranted, you would craft one with both parties involved. I had the opportunity many years ago to represent the late Monroe Inker, and he was one of Boston's top divorce attorneys. And in his earlier years, he was very ruthless, representing, sort of the wealthier of the two parties. And in his later years, he actually turned and started representing women because he realized that, maybe some of those decisions may not have been the most beneficial overall. And one of the things that he had said was, try to keep things as quiet as you can while you're in the court of law. Try to keep people from, maligning the other party, taking it to social media, doing things that would, it doesn't necessarily influence the legal decision, as you know, but it does create a groundswell of public opinion that could damage reputations or companies moving forward. So that's the approach that I always try to take, looking at all of the different lenses and figuring out the best possible strategy. Now, I will say, if someone is being portrayed, let's say that someone has a social media account and they're portraying the wife or the husband as a gold digger, and that's going out and it's going viral, and there are all kinds of retweets and noise and chatter about that. One strategy might be to portray the other spouse in a very humble position at the park in a t-shirt and jeans, playing with their kids on a swing set and posting those social media images to kind of counteract the dialogue that's going on. And as Nancy had said, it truly depends on the situation. But my first move is always, let's work it out in a court of law first. And I think the best divorces in family businesses of great wealth, no one knows what's going on until it's over.
Monroe Inker was a mentor of mine and one of my most formidable opponents. He taught me a lot. He was quiet. He was not, there was not the public dramatics, very true. But I will tell you that he was able to do that because he was fierce in the courtroom. So it might not have hit the news, but he was quite the formidable attorney. And I learned from him just like I'm learning from you. So thank you for those insights. Nancy,
Lisa, I'm sorry. I would just say that one of my personal favorite career moments at the end of his career, I got him the cover of the Boston Globe magazine called The End of Love. And it was a profile on Monroe and his shifting from being known as the Cobra to taking up, this new charge with defending for free battered women. And I just thought it was wonderful. And sadly, he died just a couple of months after that ran. So I just felt that that was an amazing career moment because he was such a talented individual. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for adding that. That's so important. Nancy, family dysfunction can bleed into business. How do you coach individuals who are experiencing family strife, and how do you help them protect the business?
As I listened to that question, it came to mind. I have a client that I've been working with for over 5 years. The mother owns the business, and she has 2 sons that work in the business. I knew at the very beginning that it was a fueled relationship, and that sometimes it was extremely loud, lots of swearing, and sometimes objects flying. And I hadn't seen anything like that, but I had heard that sometimes that happens. So when when we were meeting as a group, the 4 of us, it was one morning, and apparently something had erupted between the 2 brothers earlier, and they were still fueled by it when they came into the meeting. And then one of the brothers said something to really upset the other one. And before you know it, I literally had to duck because a chair was flying, and then a broom flew, and it was, and so, getting into the middle of that and trying to diffuse it. And we came up with an approach. What I decided to do is say, listen, I want you guys to come up with a code word. Whatever this word is, it needs to be something that you all can relate to, that is going to help, so that all of you, on a dime, you will stop. Because this kind of toxic, swinging and throwing and screaming is not going to solve anything. And so calmer minds prevailed, and the code word that they chose together, the 3 of them, was their family dog's name when they were a child. And so there was that emotional attachment to that. And so another time, it was probably about 4 months later, that it elevated again. And one of the brothers used the word, and it did. They all, boom, stopped. No, and just like everybody, they kind of went to their corners, if you will, took a few minutes to decompress. Everybody came back to the table, and we started talking again. And that has worked to this day. They still use the dog's name. And that has been a remarkable transition for them to be able to shut it down and recalibrate, and to be able to really get back to business at hand.
That's really nice. Thank you. That's very important to know. I'm sure that would help in many situations, many family situations. Let's move now to the issue of the faltering founder.
Yes. So, Lisa, I'd love to be able to ask, tell us about your work with families and businesses where the founder is experiencing the diminished capacity, which puts the business and family finances at risk.
Yeah, so we discussed a little bit of this a moment ago in connection with seeking conservatorship. Sometimes the founder is experiencing diminished capacity and can't handle the business. So if there's a power of attorney, then a durable power of attorney is different than a power of attorney. A durable power of attorney is one that endures through incapacity. So if there's a durable power of attorney, then the person nominated can handle the business and handle those affairs, so long as the durable power of attorney lists as one of the powers the ability to run the business. If there's no power of attorney, or if there's resistance, then often you need to turn to conservatorship. Conservatorship is the court appointment of somebody to handle personal and business-related financial affairs. This can also be done through a trust. People will list a trustee or successor trustees to themselves, so that if there is a diminishment of capacity, the successor trustee can step in, and that will help. I remember handling one matter involving a gentleman who was starting to falter, and his sons were able to take over the business. They had the authority to do so. It had been planned for, it was organized, it was neat, and that is the best case scenario. But if it can't be done in an organized way, then very often it requires a conservatorship. And if there are family members who are vying for control, and the person who is then in charge is faltering because of a diminishment of capacity, and there's a belief that there is swaying of the patriarch or matriarch in the direction of certain family members, swaying of affections or swaying of, influencing decisions, then it may turn into a undue influence action in court. Again, the best way to handle this is out of court with a mediator or in negotiations, but it can combust into undue influence litigation.
Lisa, it's interesting. It just made me think about something else. I'm curious, what have you seen in your work regarding the impact of a late life romance of a business founder or owner, specifically on the business interests and family finances and inheritance expectations and succession predictability?
Yeah, these are my favorite. My favorite of what I do is both resistance to the aging process and resistance to succession planning, as well as late in life romance. These are incredibly nuanced issues that call on skills they have lawyering skills for sure, and knowledge of various areas of law, descent and distribution, inheritance law, matrimonial law, divorce law, the courts, the judges, the clerks, the parties, opposing counsel, the family dynamics. It's poetry in the way that it can be handled. But beyond that, it also requires an understanding of people, a little bit of emotional intelligence to understand how to leverage a result. But I have handled some heart-wrenching but really interesting matters where somebody late in life who is in control of assets and business assets in particular develops a late life romance. They just want to have love, care, companionship in life. They just don't want to be alone. And we've got risk to business interests and risk to family finances. In one of these matters, I was retained by the adult children of the patriarch, and we resolved it with a trust. And we incentivized the younger person who had the romantic interest who had come into this patriarch's life. And we incentivized her with a trust that said that if she stays with him and if she's living with him, she would receive certain distributions from the trust. And so we actually incentivized her to stay, which was a little counterintuitive. We thought either she's going to go, problem solved, or this is real and we need to respect it. And so we incentivized it with a trust. In another matter, I was representing a family where the patriarch had a new romance, and we thought it was headed in the direction of marriage. And by the way, once you get into marriage, then you're dealing with matrimonial laws where there are opportunities to elect against a will and upend the will because the spouse now has rights to inherit. It changes who gets what. If there's no will, it completely upends our inheritance laws in terms of who gets what, because it's going to mean less for the children from a prior relationship. It creates support obligations. It creates all kinds of issues. And so the only way to prevent that is with prenuptial planning or trust planning, but usually prenuptial planning is the better way. Prenuptials will deal with not only divorce, but also death. And in fact, prenuptials were initially a tool used in anticipation of death. It wasn't until about a century after the first prenuptials were allowed that it ever became a tool to use in divorce. It was really an estate planning tool from its inception. But when you're dealing with a prenuptial agreement for somebody who has diminished capacity, sometimes they lack the mental capacity to sign it. And in that case, you may need court authority through a conservatorship to have a conservator sign it on behalf of the incapacitated person, the elder. So those are all very interesting and exciting matters. Ultimately, the goal is to promote individuals' dignity, self-determination, their right of association, the basic fundamental right to have love in their life, but also the right to not be exploited and influenced against their interest and to the detriment of a family business. The other fascinating thing that I want to hear about is embezzlement, family embezzlement. So Tara and Nancy, what have been your experiences in family embezzlement?
So I'll set the stage and Nancy will talk about our strategy. A couple of years ago, we worked with a financial tech company, siblings. One was actually the president of the company and one was the CFO. Interestingly enough, because they were kind of scrappy and building this business from the ground up, one of them focused on the external activities of the company, landing new clients, looking for ways that they could, get better business in. And so he's out on the stump doing speeches and negotiating and finding new clients, while the CFO was controlling the payroll, controlling the books, and making sure that all of the finances supposedly were in order. Well, an audit came to be, and the CFO was notified that the books were going to be audited because the auditor saw something and it was the state auditor, that saw something was amiss in their filings. Now, mind you, they also had a third-party audit that never caught any of this. What the CFO had been doing for a number of years was writing invoices for computer equipment that was supposedly ordered but never received. And all of those invoices were, right there for everyone to see. And the saddest thing was that the CEO, the president of the company, said to us, if I had only looked at those books, I would have caught it. And the blind trust that he had in a family member, enabled him to allow this to go on for many, many years. And so he had a real reputation problem with all of his employees when the news broke. Nancy?
Yeah, and I think the hardest thing, the CEO was like just frozen and couldn't believe the betrayal, not only as a family member, but like just I think it was like 18 years that he had been doing this. And the CFO justified it because he actually was using that money to help out people that were in need. So it gave him a feel good, but he had justified it in his own head. And he had been doing it and he just kept, he started out just a little bit, which is usually what happens. They test the water and then they do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And they continue to justify that they're doing something right and that it's just. And it was very difficult, for both of them to deal with that situation. And, it was surprising for us that the CFO actually went to the CEO and said, hey, listen, but he knew he was against the wall and that it was going to come out. But the fact that he had enough, courage to be able to say, listen, this is what's happened. I'd rather have you hear it from me. And then, as if any of us could imagine what the CEO was like, whoa. And just not even believing, like, how can this be? And helping to process him through that, to be able to get to meaningful traction and making decisions of what needs to happen to be able to best support the business internally and externally was mission critical. And that's where we spent a significant amount of time helping him.
And it was letters to stakeholders, letters to their employees, and letters to their clients, letters to their stakeholders, to their board. And then we messaged him to have personal meetings with the staff to talk about the situation. And they're doing well now, for sure. Replaced the position and they're still continuing to thrive.
What an incredible situation. That's definitely a crisis. We have time for just a few more questions. It's already 5 of the hour. Let me go right to you, Tara, talking about an unexpected C-suite family member's death. So when a founder, owner, or executive dies, how do you position the business leaders and the business?
Well, again, if there's succession planning, it's easy. When there's no succession planning, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But this may sound really gruesome to everyone. However, all of my clients have a statement concerning their death. Whether you're a bank president, a manufacturing CFO, whether you're in high tech, accidents happen, things happen unexpectedly, and we want to have the basis of the accomplishments and the resume of that executive at the ready should the worst happen, because you need to act very swiftly to have a statement out on a website or delivered to employees or sent out to your stakeholders. So I think that that's really important. And the other piece is to ensure that the business is going to continue to run and that there is business continuity. And my partner, Nancy, ran into a situation, and I'm going to just have her tell the story very quickly because I know we're running out of time, where she had faced this head on.
Yeah, so there's two real quick ones that I'll explain, because oftentimes we think we're invincible and the time is finite, and then it's not finite, that you like your day is going to happen. And even though that's morbid, the real thing, one of these, there was a owner of a company, family business, and he was coming out of the Bruins game, and he was on the Mass Pike coming home and had a major heart attack, crashed and died instantly. He was in the middle of a major acquisition, and all the intellectual property, all that knowledge died with him. And so it was a fiasco. I mean, it was just a major issue. Literally the following week is when they were closing on this major deal. So that's one. The other one is a managing partner of a family law firm, where the managing partner was very healthy, ran every day, just had his physical, perfect health. He fell asleep, never woke up. And he was the glue of that law firm. And because it's family, they were mourning his loss, yet the business was falling apart. So we came in and really helped to try to create some kind of structure and prioritizing of what needed to happen. And, it's the internal and the external needs that really required a tremendous amount of work. And so that was, that took quite a while, but they are doing well now.
And Lisa, it's interesting because when it comes to structure, people put off planning. In our field, they don't want to plan for a crisis. Why? Because it's not a revenue generating event. They don't want to have a will. Why? Because they think that they're never going to die and they're going to live forever. So what can they do? And what steps can they take in advance for you? And how do you coach them to be ready to take that leap?
Yes, so I do work with families, asking them to just bite the bullet and deal with the inevitable, which is the unimaginable death. And so I ask people to sit and do some planning so that they can draft their will and they can have trusts. They need to think not only about what they want in the future for the disposition of their wealth, but when they hear about the value that's going to be lost to taxes, maybe that might fire them up to do something about this. They want their assets to go to the next generation or to their spouse or both at different times and to different degrees and in different dimensions. And so they want that to happen without a big tax hit. And the estate taxes are enormous. So that creates a little bit of motivation. People's businesses are their babies. They are our life force, and they are so important to us, just as family is. They are really the baby in the family because they just keep growing. And they just keep evolving, and they're with us every morning when we wake up and every night when we go to sleep. No matter what, they don't launch unless we launch them out. And so business succession planning is also something that has to be done so that people will know who's going to take over and under what circumstances. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, whether you're in a business or in a family business, or whether you're an advisor to a family business, to not forget the importance of successor trustees, because ultimately, the fiduciaries nominated to take over sometimes have bad things happen and they become unavailable because of disability or death. So there needs to be consideration to successor fiduciaries as well. And I see now that we are at the conclusion of the hour. So I just want to wrap up. But before I wrap up, Nancy and Tara, would you please let people know how they can reach you? Because I'm sure that this conversation has been very thought-inspiring. We don't have questions yet in the Q&A, but there are going to be questions that come up by the many people watching. And if the tape is distributed, we want you to be able to be reached. So Nancy, will you give your contact data?
Sure. So my cell phone number is 508-380-8155. I can also be reached at Nancy@crisisinterception.com.
Great. And Tara?
And my cell phone is 617-650-2644. And my email is tara@crisisinterception.com.
Thank you. And I'm Lisa Cukier, your host for the Business of Family webinar. I can be reached at 617-966-9582. And my email address is lcukier@burnslev.com. That is LCUKIER@BURNSLEV.com. So thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Tara, for joining the episode today. I learned so much from you, and I always enjoy hearing the stories that you tell. Thanks for joining us, and thanks everybody else for listening.
Thank
Lisa,
you.
thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.